Welcome to the Geek Gab RPG special. I'm your host, Dorrinal. On this show, we're going to talk about role-playing games, how to play them, how to run them, different tips and tools and tricks. We got a great show tonight. We've got the usual folks here. We've got a great panel. We've got the best panel, in fact. We've got our fearless leader, Daddy Warpig, joining us. He's been running RPGs for years and years and years. And we've got Brian Niemeier, our usual co-host as well, author of the Dragon Award-winning Soul Dancer books. You guys may not know this, but his books were inspired by his role-playing at the gaming table, running his games. And we also have our special guest, Jeffro Johnson, author of Appendix N, the literary history of Dungeons and Dragons. Why don't you say hello?
Hey, thanks for having me back.
This is awesome. I've muted poor Daddy Warpig, and I can't unmute him. I wanted him to say hello.
Is it really a Geek Gab if he doesn't say, "We are back"?
Hey, Brian, how's it going?
Busy. I'm actually taking a break from revising not one, but two books right now to come and share my accumulated wisdom from the RPG table. And yeah, thanks for putting this together, man. This is going to be great.
I'm really looking forward to it. So tonight's topic, we're going to talk about OSR, also known as the Old School Revival. We're going to talk about a couple of other things like tips and tricks and tools for people. And for those of you live, chat with us live, ask some questions. If you have some questions about running a game or problems with your game that you want our panel of experts to answer, we'll try and answer those at the end of the show.
And honestly, I'm waiting with bated breath to hear what Jeffro was going to say, because he's a man, but let's find out.
This is going to be wild, folks. So let me start with what I think about OSR. OSR is also known as Old School Renaissance or Old School Revival. And to me, I'd describe it as people rediscovering the rules and systems used by the people who created RPGs. And it's a little more than that, though, because it involves rediscovering the reasons and the inspirations for those rules. Reasons being why those rules existed at the gaming table, and inspiration as Jeffro Johnson points out in his book, where did a lot of those rules come from? So what do you guys think? What does OSR mean to you, Daddy Warpig?
I came to the OSR very, very late when I started participating in an internet message board that pretty much, as far as I can tell, the vast majority of OSR people participate on. And I met, just a ton of people there who are actual, have published their own OSR rule sets. Somebody just linked to a blog post by Rob Conley, and I'm like, oh, I know Rob Conley. I discuss things a lot with him. There's a gentleman right now who's making a mega dungeon with Gary Gygax's son, and I know him from the message board. We've talked for a long time. We still do every now and then. And so the way I came into the OSR was a bunch of people who were talking about classic D&D, talking about classic dungeoneering, who had been having arguments with 4th edition fans for years. And I came to this before the 5th edition was even announced or being thought of. So Pathfinder was on its rise. Pathfinder had taken over the #1 selling spot in role-playing, taken it away from Dungeons and Dragons. 4th edition was dead. And I met all these people who not only had written or were working with retro clones of D&D, of whatever edition of D&D they preferred, but I was also talking to people who had gone out and made their own style of games, like Stars Without End, which is a hex crawl in space, where you are exploring system after system that is completely unknown to you. You don't know what's out there, and you're going in and exploring system after system. A really interesting concept, something I wish I had a chance to play. Other people had published, superhero stuff, steampunk stuff, all based around old Dungeons and Dragons material. So when I got involved with discussing things with these people, it was from a completely different direction than a lot of other people who are involved from the beginning.
That's really interesting. You mentioned something in there that I wanted to point out was particularly old school. You said Hex Crawl in space.
Yes.
The Hex Crawl is one of those rediscovered systems that is sort of associated with the OSR, which, in my experience, gaming through the 90s, during like the White Wolf's heyday, the storytelling gaming's heyday, it was a construct that I wasn't familiar with at all, where you actually, the game master has a map of a region on a hex paper, and the players will go out exploring the wilderness, or in your example, exploring outer space. And the dungeon master would keep track of where they were by using this hex map. And so the players would be crawling along the hex.
And the reason why things like this had to be rediscovered is because, at least from the games and the magazines that I was reading in the mid-'80s, a lot of people came in and they wanted to make something bigger and better and more mature. And there was even in like GURPS second edition, for example, great system, but it includes in there derogatory statements towards the old style fantasy tabletop role playing, and the attitude was that this was childish, or this is a kid's game. But now we're moving on to the really good stuff, the stuff that really cool people play. And it took a long time to break through some of these attitudes because it was so pervasive.
Here's the thing, and this just occurred to me today because I was working this out as a result of playing a game called The Room 2 on the iPhone, and trust me, this is going to tie back into D&D. The Room is all about a series of puzzles. You're presented with objects in a room, and you have to figure out how to manipulate these objects. You have to look close to find things. You have to figure out which switch to flip, how to take stuff apart, how to put it back together. It's all based around puzzle gameplay. And the original versions of Dungeons & Dragons, the original model for Dungeons & Dragons, the assumed gameplay model that was not transmitted in the books. They didn't write about it in the books, and so it didn't get transmitted to people who picked up Dungeons & Dragons box sets at Walden Books. The model for that is traps and situations and solving the puzzle. And I think that even if you're not going full dungeoneering, even if you're not going full hex crawl, even if you're not going full D&D, that kind of thinking, that kind of player agency, that kind of interacting with objects in the dungeon, but also interacting with creatures in the dungeon who may or may not be hostile to you. This is a critical part of D&D that got left out, is if you ran across a bunch of orcs, you didn't necessarily have to attack them because they weren't necessarily going to attack you. You could negotiate with them. They might be hostile, and you could negotiate with them, or they might even be friendly for whatever reason. And the game master would have to come up with reasons to explain this reaction check. But one of the things I've been thinking about today, and what I'm saying is the OSR has had a lot of influence beyond just publishing new versions of old D&D stuff. It's had a lot of influence beyond even people who made direct D&D inspired games that have nothing to do with fantasy gaming, like, again, Stars Without End. But it has had a large effect on actual game designers who have gone back and wrapped in some of the original concepts from D&D into their designs because they think to themselves, like I've done, wow, that's interesting. That could be a really good route to take this, that even if we're not playing a class game, even if we're not playing a strict dungeoneering campaign, even if we're playing with skills, that it might be more interesting to borrow that puzzle, trap, clue mentality. And here's where I got to today. I have mentioned before I'm designing my own RPG. And while I was playing the Room 2 today, what I thought of was this. It has been typically in skill-based games where if you wanted to find something in the room, the players would roll the dice, and if they succeeded, they found it. Or you have the problem where if players roll the dice and they failed, they wouldn't find it at all. So other games have come along, and I'm thinking specifically of Gumshoe and its variants and games inspired by it. They've come along and said, okay, well, we're not going to force you to roll. Instead, we'll give you investigation points, and you can just automatically succeed. We'll assume you automatically succeed, but if you run out of investigation points, then you can't do this anymore. So that's another approach. My approach is it's not old school because it doesn't harken back to D&D. It's not part of the explicit D&D experience because it is based on skills and it's based on characters having different skills, not player ability. But instead of just telling players, oh, by the way, you've succeeded, here, you found this. Instead of telling players that, the search total will actually give them clues about what it's like in the room that they might have overlooked, the players might have overlooked themselves. And so it's still a puzzle. The players still have to go through it and solve it, but the higher this character's search skill, the better the character is at looking, the more information the player will have at their disposal to solve this puzzle. And the exact rule, by the way, that all this is based on is if the player gets it right, they just get it. They don't have to roll. So if the player says, I want to look in this one book and I think the envelope is there, if the envelope is actually there, you don't make them roll a search total. They figured out the puzzle without having to make a skill check. They just succeed. So it's not OSR, but it has been heavily influenced by descriptions of old school play.
And skill checks aren't exactly OSR either. I mean, in general, the type of gameplay that skill-based games generate is the players try and figure out which skills apply to the situation so that they can make a dice roll against that skill. And it creates all those weird situations where if you don't have the right skills, even diceless systems like Gumshoe do this, where certain clues are available to people with certain skills, and if you don't have those skills, you're not going to find it. When I think a lot of old school minded games, you're going to the DM is going to let them players explore and find out on their own. There's a great saying from the webpage that I use as my resource where he says, player skill implies character skill. In other words, if you think of something or you think to do something, then your character thought of that. The character basically gets that skill. And it makes for sort of a seamless gameplay where you're not worried about like what skill to roll. Like, have you guys ever played a game of D&D, like especially 3rd edition or Pathfinder, where your player looks at you and says, I'm going to knowledge nature this, and they just roll the dice before you say anything?
Yeah, describe your answer. Every time they do that, I say, describe your actions. Just describe your actions. What are you doing? Engage with the imagination side of it. Don't as Bradford C. Walker puts it, don't try to pilot the mech. That actually, all those rules and roles don't actually have anything to do with imagining the situation. So, like, why are you inserting? The big problem with that is that the players are, in my opinion, they're making dungeon master rulings without getting your consent. And, how do they know that you're not just going to say, yes, it worked? They don't know that. They're assuming that they won't. So what happens when they say, I'm rolling this, and then they fail? The GM's going to be like, okay, I guess you didn't see anything. But you don't know that what he was going to rule. You don't know that. And so it's a gaming culture that it's fundamentally different from the sort of assumptions that I would have made back in the 80s. It's just not how I would even think about the game.
What I'm thinking of, I like the idea that I think I ran across it first in one of your blog posts. There is a benefits to the idea that the game master rolls all the dice. There are a lot of benefits to that the players only engage in telling the game master what they want to do. He decides what the rules are behind his screen, and he rolls the dice and then tells the players what happened. I think, and here's where it ties into what you were talking about. The ideal point for a role-playing game to me is if the players can be allowed to forget about the rules and only think in terms of what their character is going to do. Where they're going to walk, how they're going to talk, what actions they're specifically taking in the game world. So instead of saying, okay, well, I come into the room, we need to find this letter, and I'm going to use the same example because this is the example I've been thinking about, and then they roll a search total because the Game Master says, okay, we'll roll a search check, and they roll a search total, and the Game Master says, well, after searching this room, you find it in this book, and then players read the clue. That's fairly typical, and that's actually above average for most GMs in most games. But with players not rolling the dice at all, not even have access to their character sheets during the game, they can say, okay, we come to this room, what's in this room? And the Game Master if the presumption is that players have to describe what their character is doing, that immediately places an onus on the Game Master to better describe the environment they're in. Right. Because he can't just cheat and say, roll a search total. He has to say, there's a large desk in the center of the room. It's a mahogany desk. It's got a roll-away top. Along one wall is a vast bookcase filled from the top of the ceiling to bottom with many, many books. And there's also letters and papers shoved in between these books. There is a fireplace on the other side of the room. There's no fire in it, but you can see that there are ashes in it. What do you do? And then include whatever, other details you personally as a GM might say, okay, well, there's a poker there too. There's a picture of the fireplace, whatever. The assumption then is that you have to describe the world well. For the players to be able to describe their actions, they have to know what kind of space they're acting in. You have to describe it well enough so that they can see it in their mind, and that makes the game world more concrete, that makes the game world more understandable, that gives the players a better feeling of the environment they're in. It allows you to communicate small, subtle hints about the world they're in. For example, instead of saying, oh, there's a bunch of books on the wall, you can say, the wall is filled from top to bottom with graphic novels and manga. That immediately conveys one type of character. Or you can say, well, the bookcase is filled from top to bottom with books on politics. That immediately conveys a different kind of NPC character. Or you can say, well, the bookcase is filled from top to bottom with strange volumes written in alphabets that you've never seen before. And that immediately conveys something entirely different. And then the players are forced in this system where they don't see the dice at all and they don't see their character sheets at all, other than their inventory and stuff. They don't see the mechanics. They're forced to come in and say, okay, well, what I want to do is look to see if the shelves are dusty, and if they are dusty, if any of the dust has been disturbed. That's one specific action that the character is taking, and the GM can say, well, yes, in the middle of the second shelf from the top, one of the books, the dust in front of one of the books has been disturbed. Well, immediately they know that someone's taken that book off the shelf for whatever reason, and they can continue to investigate. I don't want to go fully that direction with the players never rolling the dice, but I think a really good compromise between the old school method and the new school method is players have their inventory. They have cards or sheets or whatever for any special effects they have, spells, miracles, martial arts maneuvers, whatever. And then during the game, they don't have access to the game mechanics for their character, so they're not thinking in terms of game mechanics. They still have their dice, and they can roll their dice and do well or do poorly as they choose. But the game master is the one who tells them what skill to roll. He tells them when to roll it, and he tells them whether they are starting this off well or badly. And then all that the players have to interface with the world is not numbers. It is the game master's description of the world and their description of the actions they take in it.
Yeah, and some of them, I run games at cons, and I see people coming in from the other tables that just want to sit in on an old school game. And some of them actually can't handle it. They look at a basic D&D character sheet, and they are in a state of panic for the entire 4-hour session because they actually genuinely feel like they can't do anything. It's bizarre to me. I can't. But they never get over it. It's almost like there's and this is where you get into hurting people's feelings. But so this is just a conjecture.
Oh, my favorite part. Let's hurt some feelings.
But it's almost as if that there's a generational difference for some of these people. The way they've grown up, the way that all their toys have stories baked into them already, and all their video games have cutscenes already built into them, and they've got way more movies and television on tap than I would have had when I was their age. And so they've never had the space in order to actually exercise their imaginations in the same way that we did. And so when you put them in a situation where they either have to get creative or the kobolds are going to kill them, then they just die because they can't imagine there being any lateral moves that they can take in these kinds of scenarios.
And that reminds me of the way I deal with new players, because I have to do the same sort of thing. And it's one of the reasons why I changed my game from 3.5 D&D to D&D 5th edition, is because I was teaching new players how to play, and we sort of rushed through character creation. I'm like, don't worry about all these numbers, well, I'll just tell you to roll when the time comes, which is a good policy. But then halfway through the session, there'd be a combat or some tense situation, and the new player is just looking down and staring at his character. When I ask, okay, it's your turn, what do you want to do? And he just stares. And so I've had to do this several times. I actually reach over, grab his brand new character sheet that we just made for him, and I rip it off the table and I throw it on the floor, and I said, forget anything on that sheet. And I look him dead in the eyes and I say, what do you do? It's clear that the system got in the way.
Very
It worked
illustrative.
really. Go ahead, Brian.
No, that's a perfect illustration.
What about your experience with OSR, Brian?
It's very limited. I've only played one campaign set in it, and our GM was a little quirky. He used a book called Lamentations of the Flame Princess. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of that.
Oh yeah,
It's a Raggy's game.
She sounds hot.
Here's the link to it.
it's totally metal. It's the most metal RPG ever.
Okay. Yeah, got the link updated there. Yeah. And well, see, this is where I totally derail things, because I'm one of those heathens who basically grew up in the RPG wilderness like Romulus raised by wolves. Okay. So I've never really played at any gaming conventions. I've really only played with a rather small inbred group of guys and in my local area. And we do things totally wrong. We always have. So when approaching Lamentations of the Flame Princess, yeah, I like the system, but again, our games are totally like theme and story driven. So the GM that we have running this, and he's really avant-garde. He's really heavy into surrealism, like China Evil books and stuff. So you run into what you think is a little girl, but when she turns around, she has like a screaming void where her face should be with spider legs coming out of it, that kind of thing. And people throw ducks at balloons and nothing is as it seems. That kind of mind-bending, and psychedelic like that.
That's weird, man.
Oh, weird doesn't even begin to describe it. So he just pitched a game to us. I just got a text message today. He's like, I'm thinking of running a new game, 1967 plus the secret space program, plus displaced people, plus Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, plus Marvel's Eternals.
That's the right way to do it. That is exactly the right way to do it, because mashup is it sounds dumb. It seems like it wouldn't make sense, but the more you mix in to the conglomeration and the more wildly diverse it is, the more it actually it really does work at the table. It's counterintuitive in some ways, but it is just insanely fun. And if you look back at all the old RPGs, all of them are just crazy conglomerates.
Well, that's reassuring.
I got a question for you guys. Now I feel much better about my understanding of OSR and what it is, but why? Can you guys tell me why you would explore the old school rules?
Can I answer that one?
Of course.
All right. Now everybody's different, but I didn't get to tell my journey to the OSR. I was sort of OSR before OSR was its thing. I never got over Car Wars, and I read those rules, and I always wanted to play an RPG campaign with them the way they seemed to indicate they should be played. But growing up in the 80s, there's so many things competing for your time, so many new games coming out, just never got around to it. So when I finally, got where I was mature enough to form gaming groups and run things the way I'd imagined they should go, it's like just start going through my list of gaming dreams, things that I wanted to do before I died. You kind of can't help what's on that list, but you start doing it. And then with the internet, there are all these games that I heard about. Like in the introduction to second edition GURPS, there's mentions to Tunnels and Trolls in there, and I'd never seen a copy of that. And in my Car Wars box, there was a reference to a Space Gamer magazine that sounded like the most awesome magazine ever. And so when you can finally get those things on the internet and get all these editions you've never seen before, and not only that, you can hear from all these other people that have session reports on them. The exciting thing about the OSR, being one of those kids that has unfulfilled gaming dreams, is that you have all these resources to help you get these things on the table. And I think one of the things that has come out of it, just by having this wide open discussion, is that you suddenly have the support group and the insight to look at some of these old games and seriously take them apart and experience them for what they were, under the assumption that they are not broken. I think that outside of the discussion, the default setting for almost everybody when it comes to these games is that they're dumb. They're obviously inferior to what came later. There's like an assumption of progress. But what I think we have uncovered through the wide-ranging discussions on the blogs and the actual play is that they are not often well articulated. They're not well presented, and they certainly, many of these old games needed editing desperately. But when you get to what the game design is underneath the cruft and underneath the oftentimes hard to understand rules, the game that is under there is actually some of the best gaming that you're ever going to have. It's counterintuitive, but this stuff is gold. Stuff that you looked at as a kid and said, that could never work, that's dumb. There was oftentimes, 99 times out of 100, way more to it than you ever expected. And the reason that there is a thing is that people are getting reproducibly awesome experiences. They are unlocking secrets of gaming. And it is the most exciting thing on the internet.
That is quite a statement.
I'll disagree. I think the most exciting thing on the internet is the pulp revolution, but that's...
You've got the right audience for that. Do you guys want to respond?
Ask the question again, so I can actually respond to it.
It was, why are we exploring OSR? Why explore these old rules?
I'm exploring OSR because people who I talk to and communicate with are talking about OSR. And I had come to the conclusion a long time ago that I just don't like character classes. Now, don't get me wrong. I could give you a long list of reasons why character classes do in fact work for a game and why they're the right decision for some games. And especially for Dungeons and Dragons, they were definitely the right decision for the original version of Dungeons and Dragons. I don't disdain classes. I don't assume that classes are quote unquote more primitive. Some jackass in some gaming magazine in the late 90s published this entire article about how role-playing games were like technology, and this is the first generation of role-playing games, and then we advanced to the second generation, and then we advanced to a third generation. There's a huge numbers of nitwits out there who actually believe that gaming is like a technology that's advancing. It's not. There is very little that is actually advancing in gaming other than awareness of editing, other than awareness of the necessity for clear description, and even that isn't evenly spread across the entire industry, and also production values. But I don't know that the production values, even though they produce gorgeous books that I love because they're gorgeous, I don't know that upping the requirements for production values has necessarily been healthy for the industry as a whole in the long run. In any case, the OSR is valuable. Classes are valuable. They're not intrinsically, less advanced. But I prefer skill-based systems because I find classes to be too restrictive. For example, Gandalf is almost an archetypical wizard, and yet he was able to wear armor and use a sword. And in a lot of classic D&D, wizards, magic users can't do that. Now, I'm not saying that makes it bad, and I'm not saying you should change that. You can if you want to, but I'm not saying you should, because the reason why classes work is because they're archetypes for the setting of D&D, for the dungeoneering puzzle-based gameplay that D&D was intended to implement. Those are archetypes that work well. The quartet of classes are archetypes that work well together in a party. But you need to have, in my opinion, as a game designer, if you're not going to depend on luck, my opinion is that game designers who are not going to depend on luck should have as much knowledge of other games, especially of games that might not have been talked about for a long time, because there is a lot of value to be found there. And that's the primary value I get out of the OSR, is it's a completely different approach to game mastering and playing than what I've been used to since I started playing D&D. And in looking at things from a completely different point of view, you can either find out that one, the way they do it differently is better. Two, you can find out that the way they do it differently you really don't like, and so know better why you're making a decision you're making. Make it consciously instead of just receiving wisdom from whatever systems that you've liked. Or three, think that their approach has some strengths, but that you want, and you might want to adopt some of the mechanical approaches or some of the mechanics themselves, but that you want to do it in a different way, or you want to meld it with your own approach to meeting something better. The more you know, to a certain extent, the better, especially the more different approaches you know, to a certain extent as a designer or as a person who's going to make up house rules for your game, the better off you are. That's what value I find in the OSR. I would not necessarily play the games, although I would like to sit down in a dungeon crawling old school campaign for a while and just to see how it works, to experience it from the inside. But other than that, I mainly use it to broaden my mind about possible approaches to solving problems in building a game.
I bet real money that that guy who claimed that games are progressing never said progressing toward what?
Oh yeah, the classic progressive conundrum.
I do have one example of game design progress that I would like to throw out on while we're on the subject, and it ties in both to the backward look and the moving forward themes. The modules that I grew up with would have been B2 Keep on the Borderlands, because it came in my basic set, and then X1 Isle of Dread. And these represented the two primary types of D&D adventuring. One was just a straight-ahead dungeon, the Caves of Chaos, and then the other was a wilderness, a hex crawl, like we were talking about earlier, on the Isle of Dread, with encounters and dungeon-type situations dropped here and there on the island. Now, the D&D line went off to say, what's the next thing? What is the next step in this? Well, it went from, in the basic line, it went from to companion, and then masters and immortal. And you know, I'm not. Yes, there was a domain level play in AD&D, for instance, but that's not really where a lot of people went. I mean, I know there are some campaigns who played the domain game, and got out did all the miniatures battles, but that never really stuck outside of the Wisconsin type culture. What the OSR brought to the table was and it's because of guys like Rob Kuntz, who were there at the very beginning explaining this. These modules were not the end all be all of the game. You weren't. The whole idea of Dungeons and Dragons wasn't that you would buy one module after another and just cruise through them and until you ran out of material to do. Those modules were merely an example to show you how to dungeon master, to how to create your own adventures. They were worked examples. They weren't really meant to confine your imagination. So one thing that the OSR has done to innovate is that they basically broke the story that the old rule sets were engineered from the ground up for an entirely different style of play than what the modules we bought tended to create as a side effect. Mega Dungeons is how the games were originally played, how they were meant to be played. These would be big, gigantic dungeons that you were never meant to finish, and that is what really one reason why people consistently misinterpret the old rule sets is because they aren't reading them for what they were intended for. They don't see that they were pointing to this. So it wasn't until in the past decade, the past 10 years or so, that we even got Mega Dungeon products that were published. They the whole idea around the old style of play the industry was not advanced enough to put them out.
Yeah, in fact, the products that did come out were published back in the open source days for 3.5, were just reprints and conversions of some of those classic mega dungeons from 1979 or what have you. They would just converted it to 3.5, added some of their own stuff, and published it.
So just as an example of what could be done and how innovative it is, Dwemermount from Autark is first rate, and it's not only old style D&D, it's infused with a double dose of the literature that inspired it, the game. And the other one you would really want to take a look at is Stonehell Mega Dungeon by Michael Curtis. This one's especially neat because each level is made up of 4 one-page dungeons. And they're all designed to be taken out and played separately if that's what you want to do, or you could play it as the whole shebang. But the one-page dungeon concept would be like the opposite extreme from a mega dungeon. Instead of this giant thing that you can't even publish, it's so gigantic or so crazy. A one-page dungeon, the innovation there is that you actually only need 1 page of dungeon module to run a good session. you can get quite a ways with that. Whereas if you're in the publishing business and you make money every time you sell paper, that creates an artifact in how you engineer your designs that are not actually conducive to what people actually need at the table.
Well, that gives me a whole new perspective. Let me let's move on to the next thing, and I'm going to do that by way of telling my own story, which sort of ties all this together. I was a player for years and years and years. I've been playing for as long as most of y'all, but as a player, not a dungeon master. And I played in Daddy Warpig is actually one of my dungeon masters, and his style, where he says he doesn't like classes, he likes the skill-based games. Daddy Warpig has a particular style of game mastering. And game masters of my youth were very similar, very story driven, that sort of thing, very narrative driven. And every time I tried to master a game, it just flopped, it failed. And it wasn't until I came back around to it a few years ago and found a site that Daddy Warpig linked to, I think on his blog, that brought me to a site that I want to tell everybody about. And I've said it before for people who've listened to the Geek Gab before, but the author is Justin Alexander, and the website is thealexandrian.net. And we'll make sure that all the resources are in the show notes afterwards. And this guy's been examining OSR for years, and he's been writing modules and game mastering tips for years. And he clued me into the most important things about game mastering that got me back into gaming. I was almost out of RPGs at this point. And the first thing that hit me was that being a game master is a set of skills. It's not like necessarily having your own story or anything like that, which may be Brian's experience.
Yeah.
It's not having this. I want to tell an action movie. Right, I want this sort of thing to happen, like Daddy Warpig. His games are very, very action-oriented, very exciting, like Die Hard. But that wasn't my kind of game. And the other thing he introduced me to was the whole idea of OSR. And Bradford Walker in the chat actually described the concept best. When we were talking about hex crawls, he says, hex crawl is a game procedure that brings in a feedback loop which drives gameplay. And that creates a situation where the players always have something to do. They always have a way of interacting with the game. And that doesn't involve staring at a character sheet or figuring out what skill to test or anything like that. It's, this is this world, what do I want to do with it? And that was, those two revelations got me back into gaming, and it also showed me that there's a way to learn how to be a game master, that it's not something that you either can or can't do. It's a set of skills that can't be taught. So if you head to his site, he's got a subsection called Game Mastery 101. Even if you're a veteran, go through these articles. Maybe not prep tips for the beginning DM, but if you're having trouble doing mysteries or other narrative games, he's got an article called the 3-Clue Rule, and general rules like don't prep plots. In other words, your job as the game master is to create a framework, and you know what things are happening in the world, but don't try to write a story first. Because as we all know, the players are not going to follow what you're doing. His page is full of tools and rulings and rediscovering things.
I want to say something about what you just said about don't prep plots. To say that in a different direction, to say the exact same thing Dorrinal just said, don't prep stories that you expect your players to go through. If your villain has a plot that is something he's intending to do, and he's planned it out, and there's a timetable for it, and he's got all the resources for it, that's fine. Your villains can prep their own plots for evil things they're going to do in the world. But you as a game master, don't try and create a story ahead of time that you expect the players to follow. The best thing you can do, and a lot of people still get upset at this, but I think they're wrong. I think they're taking the OSR too dogmatically, is you can prep a series of encounters, you can prep a series of situations, of scenes, and players then can move from one scene to another based on clues they find or events that happen or whatever. So if you want to create a scene at a tavern where certain things are going to happen and then players react to it the way they want to, that's great. And if that scene at the tavern can lead them to getting thrown in jail, and you've got that scene prep, that's great too. Or if it can lead them to leaving town to go on a dungeon crawl or go to meet with a noble, whatever ideas you may have, go ahead and prep those. That's fine, as long as you're not forcing the players to make specific choices, and as long as you are prepared to improvise if the players go off in a completely bizarre direction, that's fine too. Don't prep stories for your players to play through, but if your villain's plot, that's great.
I'm going to offer a differing perspective on that, and I don't think anyone should really take it as advice, but I do prep stories, and I make it work by some sort of weird reverse psychological inception. But by this point, I know my players so well and how they play that I can subtly, introduce a scenario or lay out a hook that I know they're going to fall for, and I know how they're going to react. So, yeah, there is improv involved, but if they throw me a curveball, I've already got something waiting, to exploit that.
See, I can, if I can jump in on this, there's different types of play that I think of from back in the day. For GURPS Humanx, the adventure in the back of that one. This was a GURPS product that was based on an Alan Dean Foster science fiction series. But the way that adventure was engineered is what you could call it a string of pearls, where there are a series of situations that are planned out by the adventure designer. And you don't know how the players are going to handle each individual scene. But you do know that once one comes to a close, you can generally see how it would transition to the next one. And so it gives kind of a mixture between the players can do everything they want to within an individual scene, and yet there's still a little bit of a structure here so that you never quite lose control of the game. Graphic adventures are generally built on this style of approach. So for instance, in Myst, when you're bumming around, you can do whatever you want, but eventually you'll fix the rocket, and that will take you to the next situation that you can interact with. Now, the whole idea of D&D, classic D&D, what it brings to the table that is so awesome is that style of play is exhausting to me. When I'm in an ongoing campaign that is run with that, then I'm scrambling through reading old issues of JTAS and ADQ, anything, any kind of scenario. I'm looking for anything that might fit. When I leave a session, I'm like hitting the books, saying, well, maybe I could do this, and maybe I could do that, and maybe I could do this. And I'm trying to get those things into my head so that when I come back, I can sit down, and when they do something, I can run with it. D&D is it's a game. It's a very loose structure that the players can get into, and because they have choice to do whatever they want, they'll know a dozen different things they could do at any given time. They know how much they want to push their luck in terms of how far deep they want to go. The deeper it gets, the harder it gets. So you don't have to design something that is suitable to them. You have just enough structure that they'll go find whatever they want, and it's easy to keep up with it. So the old school approach, as opposed to the more, quote, mature, story-oriented approach of old-style game mastering, to me, it's just relaxing to be able to sit down at the table and leave it wide open. And then I will point blank say to the characters, I don't know if what you're going to do is going to ruin the fun or not. I honestly don't know. So what it does is, what's the magic of it is the responsibility for keeping things fun shifts away from the game master and to the players. The players start sweating bullets because they're like, look, we don't want to make a decision that ruins the session. And so that puts the GM where he's purely adjudicating. He's not a wannabe Tolkien-esque fiction writer. He's not an adventure designer. He just has this structure and this very light system and a dungeon and a wilderness, and it just works without him having to make it work.
I love it. And if he's sufficiently prepared, he can handle.
Oh yeah.
Happens.
So for instance, this is old advice from like a back issue of Knockspell, I think, from Philotomy. You don't have to design a dungeon level in advance. You just have to know a little bit of what's down there. If they go down the stairs and you haven't designed it, in old school D&D, there's going to be a wandering monster check. So if you know what that wandering monster check is, they'll generally hit that and probably have to go back to town anyway. So you can pencil everything in and sketch out a one-page dungeon if they actually are serious about going there. So you're never sweating to prep.
Yeah, absolutely. We just spent over 5 minutes talking about the implications of one article. There's so much to the OSR, and that's why I wanted to talk about online resources. Like, there's so much there. Like, I haven't even scratched the surface of all the cool blogs and stuff that you guys have been writing and everything like that. So I want to share that with the listeners. Does anybody have something that they want to volunteer? Brian, do you have any resources or something that somebody should look up if they want to get into your style of gaming or OSR?
Well, if you want to get into my style of gaming, you're basically going to have to come to my house and play in a game, because I run one of two systems, both of which I invented. So I don't actually run OSR.
Yeah, but making your own system is more old school than you give credit.
Aha. Well, there we go. Yeah, one of them is very Rifts-tastic right now. It's very not ready for prime time. It's a situation where only I can really make it work, and just barely. So I wouldn't recommend that one. And then another one is a highly modified fusion of like WEG Star Wars and DC Heroes that my buddies and I have been using to run mecha campaigns set in like our own alternate Gundam timeline for like 14 years now, which is really mature and works really well.
Wow. Well, maybe system-wise, I don't know if it'd be appealing system-wise or not, but I think everybody Even the chat's looking for your address so we can get a game going. If there's anything cool that you want to post online, go for it. I'd love to see some of that. I mean, other than the stuff that you've converted into Dragon Award-winning novels.
That is different. I actually did a lot of that in various editions of D&D, and then developed my own systems since then. And the one that I'm currently working on that needs a lot of work is actually inspired by my novels. So went from like second and third ed D&D into my novels, and now I'm designing a game system based on those because I changed the original D&D so much. So it's this weird, crazy evolution filtered through a bunch of different screens.
That's awesome. What about you guys, Daddy Warpig, Jeffro? Do you have any resources you want to share with everybody? And please send me the links in the chat, and we'll make sure that it goes on the show notes afterwards.
Resources for playing, for being a game master, for...
So anything, really. It doesn't even have to be related to OSR. Just like, what's a good blog or resource to read? Like, how can you read up on the great things happening in gaming these days?
You know, there was something that happened in my life in late 2014 that kind of pushed me out of keeping track of new events happening in role-playing. I continue to play when and as I can and play a number of different games. I just started playing in a Star Wars campaign with the new funky dice. But I haven't been active on role-playing message boards or reading role-playing blogs, with a few rare exceptions of articles that other people link to that are particularly good. It's unfortunate. So I don't know that anything I have is current, but...
Well, that's okay. That's okay.
I've got something.
Hey, Jeffro's got something.
Okay. If you want the best gaming blogs on the internet that will always give you food for thought, that will always get you excited about gaming, and that there's always new content and great old content, everything. Top of my list right now is Save versus All Wands. That's the blog of Oaks Spalding. He made a retro clone way back, and right now he's going through taking apart first edition Tunnels and Trolls bit by bit and comparing it to first edition Dungeons and Dragons. And it's an awesome series. You have to see this. This is a side of gaming history that really hasn't gotten a lot of attention, and it's awesome. Next up, I would highly recommend Don't Split the Party. And this is this is by Rick Stump. He sat at the feet of game designer Louis Pulsifer, the designer of Britannia, classic war game. Rick has played AD&D First Edition continuously for over 30 years, and he has awesome supplements of his own that he's made for it. I didn't think it was possible.
He was supposed to be joining us tonight. He couldn't make it tonight. Sorry, everybody.
I didn't think it was possible to play AD&D. I've always been a basic guy. I looked at it and I said, nobody's playing that. Well, this is one case where I was wrong, and you can hear how much of why the rules are better than you think they are from somebody who actually really runs the campaigns. Finally, for Traveler, the greatest resource on the internet for Traveler right now is Tales to Astound. This is by a guy who has taken Classic Traveler books 1 through 3, just the first 3 books from the 1970s, the books that Mark Miller created, basically looking at original Dungeons and Dragons 3 booklets and then making 3 booklets for a science fiction game, just straight from that. this is a breakdown of not just the pulp literature inspirations of the books, not just a breakdown of what changed between first and second edition, but it's how to play the original game without the Third Imperium setting that became inseparable from it in the minds of gamerdom. It would be like if you said, let's play D&D, and people couldn't imagine doing anything other than Forgotten Realms. That's what's happened to Traveller. And if you look at what the game was...
Are you saying that's not what happened to D&D?
Well, you know, did that happen for real? Anyways, that book is that blog is first class, and it's by Christopher. His last name starts with a K. I can't pronounce it. He's just top-notch blogger. All of these guys are first rate. There are so many more. It's insane. But if I had to just pick three that I'm reading currently religiously, those are the three.
I have one recommendation that I was trying to remember as I was giving my half-assed answer. There was one recommendation it came to the show with, because you sent out an email saying, you must come to the show with one recommendation, and I had one. I had a recommendation, and then you asked the question, and it went right out of my brain. It didn't help that I was also taking notes at the same time. So my apologies. I was doing two things at the same time. Literally, while I was talking, I was typing something up into a document. The one recommendation I have is this. If you want to play Dungeons & Dragons, if you want to know what the old school dungeoneering and the old school puzzle solving gameplay was based on, where it came from, there's an obscure book that I haven't talked about on the show before, but it's really, you know, pretty good. It actually goes back through some of the sources from which Gary Gygax drew inspiration to and I apologize, I haven't mentioned this before, but it's a good book. You'll want to check it out. It goes back through some of the sources that Gary Gygax drew inspiration from, and Dave Arneson drew inspiration from, so that you can kind of understand what they meant to do with the rules they were writing, even though they didn't explain the rules to you well. They didn't explain how they used the rules in play. They didn't explain the gestalt of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons or you know, the Holmes Moldvay or White Box or whatever, even though they didn't explain the intended gameplay style. If you go back and look at some of the things that inspired them, some of the things that would explain a lot of the mysteries of Dungeons & Dragons, then that can help you kind of get a feel for what they intended the game to be. There is and fortunately for us, in Gary Gygax's first edition AD&D Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, at the very back of the book, he has a bunch of appendices, one of which is a list of works that inspired him in creating Dungeons & Dragons. Not just Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, but the entire concept for the game from the beginning. It's Appendix N, and in connection with the OSR, a lot of writers, a lot of game bloggers have talked about the books that were part of it and have, you know, analyzed and dissected. What I would recommend is, when it comes to looking at the works and the authors in Appendix N, it's always better to actually go back and read the books themselves. So there's a book called Appendix N, The Literary History of Dungeons & Dragons, that you can go and take a look at, that goes through all these Appendix N authors, reviews some of their books, and shows you how they affected the game. So I would recommend, seriously, go look at this book on Amazon. There is a link to it in the description of the video. Read it, see how it affected D&D, and then go and read the story. They're very easy to acquire. These stories are thanks to modern day technology and ebooks, you can buy all kinds of stories for 99 cents or for free. You can buy everything an author's ever written. Go check out this book, Appendix N, A Literary History of Dungeons & Dragons, and then once you've read one of the blog posts, one of the chapters about these specific books, go and read the book and understand what it was that they were drawing on when they created Dungeons and Dragons. That would be my recommendation.
That's outstanding.
And on that note, I am going to have to take off here to go and produce more thrilling entertainment for you all. But just want to say thanks. Had a great time. And also, speaking of buying everything an author's ever written, I wanted to remind everybody that my entire Soul Cycle 3-book series is currently on sale for 4 more days. You can get it for less than the price of one copy of Scalzi's new flop. So there's that.
Heck yeah, you should do that. Thank you so much for joining us, Brian. It was a great time.
You're welcome. Thanks to you and Daddy Warpig and Jeffro. I learned a lot. And I'm always learning.
This is our first RPG special. We've been going for over an hour. Do you, Daddy Warpig and Jeffro, have a time to do a quick question and answer?
Yeah. I want to say one thing real quick before I do that. The first rule of advice for every single game master is this: know yourself and know your adventuring party, know your players. Because every single piece of advice you hear about game mastering, about how to run a game and how to play a game, might not be applicable to you. Maybe only 20% of it is applicable to you. So know yourself, know your players, and that way you will know which advice to follow and which advice to discard, because it doesn't matter how other people play the game. It only matters how you play the game. That's
excellent general advice. And it started with like a Sun Tzu thing there, like know yourself and know thy enemy.
And always remember, the players are the enemy.
Darn right. My players always roll my eyes when I talk about how disappointed I am that none of them died at the end of the session. So we've got a couple of great questions in chat, but I'll be honest, the chat have been answering their own questions. We got great discussion in the chat tonight. I did come prepared with one question, and it's actually not my question. This is something that a friend of mine who joined my open table game after work started his own game on the weekends. 100% success. I love it. He had a thing come up in his game that he asked me about, and I gave him an answer, and it ended up working out okay, just to spoil, but I wanted to know what you guys thought. So the question is, here's the setup. At the end of last session, this is a Dungeons & Dragons game, the party was split because they encountered the main villain of this dungeon who knocked out half the party and captured them. So they've all been knocked out and taken to a jail cell or something like that, while the other half of the party escaped into another part of the dungeon. So that's how the session ended. How do I run the next session, assuming all the players show up? Go ahead.
I know the OSR answer. The OSR answer is you should have hirelings, henchmen, and other NPCs around that you can play them temporarily while your character is incapacitated or even dead.
Right, and in Tunnels and Trolls, you would be playing 3 or 4 characters at once, and so if you're playing Alien and somebody gets grabbed and they've been taken to the nest and there's an egg in them, they're just gonna blow up. You just let that character be off stage for a while, and you can go back and try to save them, and it's no big deal. But if everybody's playing a special snowflake that's an army of one that can't die, because if they die or get lost, then that ruins the game. Well, you've just crippled yourself. And so I'm going to agree with Warpig on this one.
Okay, good answer. My answer was, I assumed, unlike you guys, you're thinking outside the box. This is why you guys run the games, right? I assumed that they wanted to play their characters still, so I just suggested that he go really advanced, like as if he has been running games for years instead of months, and say, you can run the whole party at the same time. You just have to use downtime to switch from character to character, or group to group, and tell the players ahead of time, I'm doing it this way.
Wow.
And have them do things like dice rolls and things while you're interacting with the other group, so that you can come back and say, okay, give me your attack rolls, give me your skill tests, that sort of thing, and try to turn that situation and create some dramatic tension out of it. Like maybe the guard heard something in the cell as they're trying to escape, and what happens next? Oh, let's switch to the other party who's trying to fight their way through another part of the dungeon to rescue their friends, right?
Another approach that you might try is that instead of creating new characters to be with the main party who wasn't captured, create new characters to be with the part of the party that was captured, and then run entirely from their point of view trying to escape. A jailbreak is a great change of pace, and it can, if they get all their gear taken away, the wizard doesn't have a spell book to memorize his spells, the thief doesn't have his pick and tools, so maybe he has to kind of scrounge for them or whatever. That can be a new challenge to where all their stuff is taken away and they have to escape and sneak out.
Yeah, I when these people get split off from the party, I take the character sheets and put them in a folder, and it's sometimes sometimes these people, they'll get wounded, they'll leave there wounded, and it's like, well, what happened to that person? Did the hobgoblins take him and put him in jail? Did he get eaten? Did some NPC party come and save him? I'll make a table of like, well, what happened with that, and I'll randomly determine what happened, and then 3-4 weeks later, somebody else dies, and I'll be like, oh, well, at the tavern you see so and so, and they're like, what? And somebody needs a character, they get that one back, and they're back in business, and it adds a little bit of kind of continuity or sub creation. It makes it seem real when you come back in the dungeon and your ex-PC is now a zombie, or has been taken over by the Spider Queen or whatever. When you have a high def game or PCs that are getting dropped all the time, there's just so many things you end up being able to do with them, and the great thing is that the players have already done the character development for you. This person that got left in the dungeon has had more attention to its personality than anything you're going to come up with for a random NPC to put in the tavern or whatever. It just takes a load off the GM from having to be this non-stop creativity machine.
I love it.
I had a question. Does the antagonist have a clear and pressing reason to leave the captured characters alive instead of imprisoning them? Or instead of just killing them, rather?
I don't recall.
That's way too complex for an RPG there, Brian. You
I mean, yes, the obvious solution was you're all dead and let's move on. Here's your 3d6.
Okay, roll 3d6 in order. We're moving on to another scene here, guys.
That does remind me. I did have a great moment, just to digress. I did have a great moment where a new player showed up and he played a wizard, and naturally he just gets killed off right away. And while I'm talking to the other players during the scene, because we're still in middle of combat and we're adjudicating the whole thing, like as I'm speaking, I pick up a blank character sheet, 3d6, and I walk over to the guy and I just set them down in front of him.
That's how you know. That's how you know you're playing real D&D right there. That's the moment, and how they react tells you far more about their character than about the quality of the game.
Yep, everybody loved it. Everybody loved it. It was a great moment.
Why is that the exact opposite? No, when I was a kid, I never wanted to do that. I thought that's inherently unfun. But why is that? Why do people get excited about that? I don't get it.
Why do people get excited by what?
When someone dies in your dungeon and you're thinking, oh no, this is going to hurt their feelings, and you hand them the blank character, the piece of notebook paper and the 3d6 so they can roll 3d6 in order again. I have seen, as often as not, people get really into it. Like they're like, oh, get out of my way. I'm making a new character. I'm coming back in there. And it ratchets up the excitement levels rather than killing the fun like you would think, like I used to think it would.
It depends on the players. It depends on the game. It depends on their expectations. I have seen where the death of one specific character would kill a campaign, where players would be more upset over this other character dying than even their own character died. Their own character died, they make up a new one, but if this one character died, they would quit the game. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying
okay, that's weird
have
to me.
seen it.
That's just weird to me. I can't imagine that.
That actually happened. I'm talking about Daddy Warpig's game. One of those types of characters in question literally died in the final scene of the campaign. And the whole table went silent. We gave this character like a minute of silence. Some people just get attached. On that note, it's well past time that we wrap this up. This has been an amazing show. I'd like to thank you guys for coming on, Daddy Warpig, Brian Niemeier, and Jeffro Johnson. Thank you guys so much for coming on and talking to me about this. It was so much fun, we may even do it again sometime. For those of you listening, hang out and chat, thank you so much for joining us. Lively discussion in the chat. All those suggestions that Jeffro made during the earlier segment, they've been pasted into the show description, so go ahead and reload that page, or if you're viewing us later, click on those links and check out all those things he was talking about.
And they can see all of us again this Saturday with 2 additional special guests. Can you tell them about that?
That's right. We're all going to be back in just a couple of days on Saturday, April 29th. It is the return of Jeffro, John C. Wright, author and YouTuber Razor Fist. We're going to hang out. We're going to talk more pulp. No, they're going to talk more pulp. I'm going to sit back, drink Pepsi, and listen. This is going to be a great show, guys. You are not going to want to miss this. Okay, so this is a new thing for me. Usually Daddy Warpig does the intro and the outro. I almost forgot that I also have to do the outro here. This has been a lot of fun.
You also have to tell them where they can get the show.
Oh, I do. We are available on YouTube at youtube.com/geekgab. I believe we're available on SoundCloud, iTunes, and basically anywhere you can get podcasts, you can get us. We're always at Geek Gab. Daddy Warpig, did I miss anything?
Nope.
Then that's it for tonight. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you guys for showing up. I want to give everybody a good night. Thank you for listening to the Geek Gab. This has been the Geek Gab RPG special for April 27, 2017. Thank you, everybody, and have a good night. And Daddy Warpig, guess what?
Hmm?
We will be back.